Well, let me take you back to 1990. What were you doing in 1990? I had just finished high school. I was about to enter my undergraduate degree. And there was, at that time, I guess I was 18 years old or so. So I liked to listen to music. And there was a song that came and was very popular. And it was by a group called Salt and Pepper. Don't know if you heard it or not. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that may be. It was a popular song. It was also quite offensive to a lot of folks who didn't necessarily want to hear that on the radio waves that cover their children's ears, depending on how old they were. And it brought kind of the discussion of sex into a public forum. But I want to suggest to you that long before Salt and Pepper ever decided to sing a song, Israel in their faith made sex a public and community affair. Because the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, you should not commit adultery, is very much aimed not just at private morality, but about community ethics. So if you think about how the commandments have been functioning as we've gone through them week by week, we've said that these commandments are not just based in individual morality, but they are based in creating a community that reflects God's character, reflects God's purposes. And so the early commandments about making sure there's no other gods before the Lord their God, that was about having a community whose purpose was to reflect God's glory. And when other allegiances and other even nations that were greater, that worshipped other gods, when they came alongside Israel, Israel was to remember that their first and foremost commitment was a commitment to follow their God. Their God would bless them, and then through them would bless the community. Had other commandments about not having idols or images. And those idols or images were not just about having other false gods, but they weren't to have anything that represented their God either. Nothing, no image or carving or piece of gold or symbol that they could somehow manipulate. God was to be an unseen God, a God who was to be experienced and heard, but never seen in the sense of having an image that represented him that he could be touched or manipulated. He had other commandments about not misusing God's name, not just in respecting who God is, but not using and misusing God's name in the oaths and promises that people make to one another, because people were not to use God to manipulate their neighbor. So too, they were to have this strange day, a day off a week where they did not labor. They didn't even do simple household chores like they would do every other day of the week. And that's why they got a reputation as being a lazy people sometimes. But they were to have this day that commemorated and remembered that God's the creator and God also is the rescuer. And this day was to honor and revere him. All of these 10 commandments were about creating a community. No different is the commandment about honoring father and mother. It's to remind them that in the community, the relationship between the older generation and the younger generation is vital and important. The older generation passes on the faith to the younger generation, and it's the younger generation's responsibility, because notice it's directed at them, their responsibility to honor the generation that's come before, their mothers and their fathers. So the faith, the Israelite faith and the covenant they have with God can be passed down from generation to generation. There's also to be a relationship between members of the community. Murder is not an acceptable act in order to get what you want from others in the community. The lives of other people were to be respected. Not just my life was to be respected, but everyone else's in the community was to be respected as well. And then there's this commandment, do not commit adultery. Not a private ethical imperative, though it certainly is that, but a community-making ethic, that there are relationships in that community that the community is to respect and to revere. And the relationship between man and woman was one of those in the marriage relationship. For Israel, and as we've looked at this series, we've considered what does it mean for Israel, what does it mean for believers coming after Jesus, and what does it mean for us as a church. But for Israel, they were to be controlled by their commitments and not by their passions. They were to be a people that were controlled by their commitments and not by their passions. When they entered into that committed relationship, husband to wife and wife to husband, that was to be the bounds in which they continued to live the rest of their life as long as both partners continued to live. There was not making one commitment at one time, and then the next thing that comes along, that they were then to jump towards that enjoyment or what resource or whatever it was that they might decide to leave their original commitment to go towards. They were not to be controlled by their passions. They were to be controlled by their commitments. And this commitment between husband and wife was meant to be inviolable as long as they both shall live. They were also to be bound to one another rather than beholden to themselves. This idea of when you enter into that marriage relationship, this man and woman, the woman and man, as they entered into this relationship, they were no longer beholden just to themselves to do as they wished, but it was an act of commitment, much like God had made a commitment to the people of Israel that they were going to limit themselves in what was now available to them. And that foundational commitment of a woman to a man and a man to a woman was meant to demonstrate, again, in their family relationships, the decision that God made when He chose Israel. If you think of it in that way, God limited Himself. In His divine sovereignty and His power, He chose to limit Himself to acting to Israel in a certain way, in a special way, in order to bless the rest of the world. And so too, the husband and wife mimicked that by limiting themselves and committing themselves in that relationship to one another. And the community was meant to respect that and to respect that relationship. Last thing it meant for them was that they were connected to a community. They were not just a couple. That their commitment that they saw to one another was to be revered and respected by a community, just as they were to revere and respect other people's commitments to one another, and so live in that kind of harmony of community. I've had the opportunity, before I came here, you knew that maybe that I did a lot of interim pastorates. So after a pastor had left a congregation, congregations would call and ask if I would be willing to step in and kind of lead them in that time of transition. And I've stepped into churches where the pastor was asked to leave because of his sexual misconduct with members of the church. I tell you that sexual ethics is not an individual affair, because when they go astray, they affect not just a family, but they affect a whole community. Those churches that I've had to step into, they needed to go through a healing process, confessing how angry and hurt they were as they went through that, beginning to learn to come to terms with what this means for their reputation as a church and as part of the community, what it means to bring healing and health again, how they can call another pastor, their next pastor, and learn how to trust again. Trust me, sexual ethics are not just individual ethics, they're community ethics. And Israel was brought, this 10 Commandments, this do not commit adultery, brought this sexual ethic into a community discussion. This is how they were to lead their life together. Now, when we think about this and how it comes to be used after the Christ event, after Christ comes in the world, and as Alex read for us, Galatians is really a letter, and that we've been reading through as we've done this series, is really a letter about a community that is trying to wrestle with what it means to be followers of Jesus Christ after the Christ event. And one of the things that Paul had to deal with as he came and he talked to them about their faith in Jesus Christ and their embrace of the freedom that Jesus Christ brought, and how the law and the teachings from the Old Testament, how they were to inform them of how they were to live, but they weren't bound by them anymore in the same sense. They were bound by being followers of Jesus Christ, which would lead them into kind of obeying what the law meant to do. They struggle with that. They struggle with that freedom. That's why our memory verse is from Galatians, that they were to understand what it meant to be free, but on the other hand, they weren't to use their freedom to indulge their sinful natures. And so, as we look into the New Testament, you find kind of two different tracks when it deals with this commandment, do not commit adultery. First of all, in the Gospels themselves, Jesus speaks of this commandment to the Israelites in his day, what it means to commit adultery. And he warns them not to take the commandment too lightly and too focused or narrow. In other words, The commandment was there to remind them what the boundaries were, but there was also the issue of having to deal with the heart. And sometimes they were so focused on what the boundaries were that they forgot to deal with the heart. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you that every man who's looked at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus was dealing with the fact that they were so focused on the commandment and making sure that they fulfilled that commandment, they could check a box. They forgot that checking the box didn't necessarily mean they were living righteously before God. It just means that they hadn't crossed over the boundary that God had set. But now he wanted them to deal with the heart. Deal with those things that lead people initially to be tempted to commit adultery. If you really want to be righteous in the kingdom of God, you need to deal with those things first and foremost. The other thing that the early church also did was they did not limit sexual ethics to adultery in the relationship between man and woman. Much more, when Paul speaks of sexual ethics in his letters to the early church, he reminded them that it was not just adultery, but promiscuity or fornication that was also at issue for the believer in Jesus Christ. It wasn't just about getting involved in a committed relationship that involves marriage and then straying outside of that, but making sure that your sexual ethics matches this gift that you've been given in Jesus Christ. To keep yourself free from sexual promiscuity, about getting involved in illicit relationships. All of those things were part of the early church's ethics. And again, it wasn't just private ethics, it was about community ethics. Paul, numerous times, had to deal with churches that were wrestling with community issues that were caused by lax sexual ethics. And so the early church became a place where sexual ethics were discussed, where the standard was held high. And that's been a calling for the followers of Jesus Christ ever since. What does that mean for First Baptist Church? Part of it, I think, is that the church, to be a community, needs to be a place where sometimes uncomfortable things, uncomfortable topics, have a place to be discussed. Maybe not always openly in a large gathering like this one, but that this is a church that's willing to discuss what it is to live the life of faith, and that involves being aware of our own sexuality and all the questions and all the difficulties that that brings. Not in order to place, as the book has said, scarlet letters on people when they cross over the line. It's not about judging and finding boundaries and then looking for those who might cross that boundaries in order to come down on them, but a place where a community is willing to discuss what it is to live the committed relationships that we find ourselves in, or to live in relationship at all. And then how do we begin to allow those relationships to reflect Christ's best and Christ's grace and Christ's encouragement and His life-transforming power through them? Because if we don't address those questions, and if we're not willing to have those conversations, I can guarantee you it's not very hard to go on Google and find communities that are. Those discussions are always being had. Are they being had in the church? The commandment, do not commit adultery, made sexuality a public affair. Not in all of its detail, but at least a part of the community of living well together. It continues to need to be so in the Church of Jesus Christ. To talk about ethics, especially sexual ethics, as a part of the body rather than forcing people to talk about those things outside in other places that are not guided by our faith in Jesus Christ commitments. It's not going to happen in every class. It's not going to happen in every section. It's not going to happen in every small group session. But is our place, is our community of faith together a place where those things can be discussed, where we can even allow, maybe, people to make mistakes and to find grace and to find encouragement after those things? That's the kind of community that I believe we get to be when we're willing to live out publicly this faith that we've been called to in all of its various aspects. And for that, may God give us guidance and give us courage